Let's take a minute or two to talk about graph and table related questions on the reading and writing exam for the digital SAT. Now, in the past, students who are just new to this think, oh, I can read a table, I can read a graph. These are going to be easy problems. But in truth, they actually can be a lot trickier than students usually think. The SAT has in the past made some tables sort of ludicrous structures that are hard to read. And graphs, even on the math side, you always have to check that the origin or the lower left corner is 0, 0, the origin, what the real y-intercept is. You might have to check the grid lines. These kind of things that you're used to accepting, you might have to be careful of on the SAT. And therefore, I suggest everybody always read the title. You read the axes, labels, and units on the X and the Y axes. And you generally read, as we see in this graph, the legend as well to see what it is. Okay? This is always important, and it will still be true. But be careful because, and we list some of these examples below the video of things you have to be worried about on graph and table related questions. Like, what is it not telling you? That used to be, could be potentially very important. For example, a table about or a chart about the number of riders on the New York City subway doesn't say anything about the frequency or probability. So if one group is the biggest number of riders, it doesn't mean it's the highest frequency or highest probability of riders. So you have to be careful exactly what we're talking about. Some graphs show changes over time. So something that's at a given date or like a snapshot of information cannot tell you about changes over time. So an answer that shows changes over time would be wrong in that case, or vice versa. These are the kind of things you have to worry about and keep alert to. So again, I would recommend reading some of the examples below to get a good idea. And I want to take a quick look and just have a quick discussion about this topic for the reading and writing graphs. Now, it looks to me the reading and writing graphs, which appear on command of evidence questions, aren't as crazy as some of them used to be. I find most of them readable. And we look at this example, this is very typical. They're going to be column charts, line charts, or tables that essentially could be made into such column or line charts with multiple columns in the table. For example, what you often see in a column chart is you will see two different columns as denoted in the legend. That allows you to make a comparison across the things. How do those two things relate to each other over time? As well, in addition to the idea of, how do they behave over time? They go down, they go up. You get a sense of change and what's happening over time, but you can also have answers that discuss the relationship between the two. So that's why you often see that. There are a couple different types of answers that any given graph could address or may not address depending on the graph. And I'm just going to jump through a few examples. So here we have a table. Again, we've got a few categories of regions and categories of services, I guess, that are offered with percentages. Not terribly difficult to read. Another table, it's presented over periods of time. So you can imagine this could probably be a bar chart of some sort as well. And what you might see is you have some columns, outlays here. Total outlays might be important, and non-defense and defense outlays might be a little confusing. Some of the columns may not be pertinent to the question. It's one thing to keep in mind. And another table, sometimes they're populated with very confusing words. In this case, the names of indigenous tribes, which as you compare them are kind of tricky to follow in some cases. And similar to that, we might have names of species of plants, things like that. Again, typically tricky names, things you don't know and haven't seen before. And again, I think probably some of these columns just seem to make up the data that's the important column, the percentage that we really care about. And other tables might have data that's, again, irrelevant. We might not need the number of torpor bouts, whatever that is. We might actually care about the duration of the torpor bouts rather than for the row for the number of torpor bouts. So usually there's going to be some information here that's pertinent and other information that might not be pertinent. And other tables might have the average Body mass, the average number of distinct, this is essentially a toxin per tadpole, the average amount of toxin per nanogram, the average amount of toxin per milligrams of tadpole body mass. These are similar, so similar in name and confusing in words that when you go down to the answer choices, you're going to have to be very careful what column name of information really is pertinent to the conditions or answers of the question. So that can create confusion in itself. So these are some of the issues you're going to run into on tables. If we look at graphs, again, we generally have on column charts is probably the most popular graph for the reading writing exam. And again, you're going to get multiple columns per chart. So they'll be broken apart in the legend, and it allows you comparison across different items, not merely over time or some other metric on the x-axis. And here's another example with a column chart. You have a spray coating and spin coating, and they're done for lowest performing and highest performing. So you can compare them across a couple different metrics, the spray versus the spin coating, and then the lowest versus the highest. So this is very typical, allows for a little more complex analysis of the tables and the answer choices. But generally, they're mostly straightforward. There's nothing about the construction of the graphs that are terribly confusing. So in addition to column charts, you might see a line chart. So we've got 4 different things charted over time with the line chart. So it's a little bit like having the different columns in the column chart, but it's structured as a line chart in this case, and it's done over time. So again, not terribly confusing. I think it's pretty clear. In this case, the median age of marriage, you can kind of tell how that's changing over time for these different groups, denoted by the lines. Again, a multi-column column chart. Another multi-column column chart. In this case, the real issue becomes the wording. It's very curious wording or difficult wording. Subsurface thermal pollution for 2 temperature conditions, current surface, maximum plausible surface. That might lead you wondering, what is this? How do I figure it out? So that might be confusing, but the structure of the tables are usually similar. And that's really it. So there could be all sorts of other types of charts you could see here. You might expect to see pie charts and so on. You really don't. It comes down to mostly column charts, perhaps line charts, and tables that fortunately aren't too complicated. But again, they can be tricky with the wording, but generally not terribly tricky in the construction of the actual table.